Hello everyone, welcome to your next class. In this one we're going to be talking about exception types in Python. This is basically the errors that Python throws when your code isn't working properly. It turns out you can actually make your own custom exception types that we're not going to design or talk about here, but as just a note, these aren't rules of Python. You can create the rules of Python yourself and establish this thing. As well, but so you can create your own exceptions. But we're going to talk about the exception types that exist in Python in default that try to navigate you towards where things are going wrong in your code. So I'm hoping to not only teach you about the types that exist, but how you should approach interpreting them and debugging. So this is hopefully be a useful class for you. So what you're going to learn is a handful of the default Python exceptions. I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm going to talk about some of the more common ones that I deal with and ways around dealing with how to handle these errors. We're going to see which ones are really common and what I look at when I interpret them and deal with, okay, if we have this error, what do we expect to infer or logically deduce where we need to figure where our code is going wrong and where we need to check it. So we only have one definition, and we've talked about it a little bit before. We're not going to spend a lot of time with new concepts here. We're just going to enrich our understanding of old concepts. We've all seen errors in Python, I'm sure, at this point. If you haven't had any errors in your code by now, you're a star. So what an exception is basically when your Python code breaks or doesn't work in some way, shape, or form. It is the error response or the error type that it has not classified it or determined it to be. Sometimes it is really accurate and points to exactly what the problem is, and it's really easy to interpret. Sometimes it's really difficult to interpret because Python's confused with what's going on as well. So understanding not only what what Python is actually saying when an error is thrown and what it's trying to tell you are very important. It requires both a knowledge of the code base itself as well as how Python is going to respond to these kinds of problems. So we have a larger syntax section today. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time writing anything down in terms of what this stuff means. We're going to go through each of these one at a time, and I'm going to talk about them. There's nothing that really needs to be written. This is a perfect thing for a table. So when Python returns an error, it returns many different exception types. You can actually name your exception, when you're doing a try and except, you can label your exception as just catch all exceptions at no matter what specific type they are by using the exception, just straight up exception name, this first row here. And this is the base class for all exception types. The most common error that people have, especially when they first start Python, no matter what code or how much experience you have, is indentation errors, meaning you haven't indented your code in the right way. You've either indented too much or too little. It's missing some information after an indentation. And the reason why this is one of the most common types is because Python is unique in the fact that it's an indented language. Indentation is important to its syntax. So what we want to do when we see these kind of indentation errors, it'll also point us to where it thinks that indentation error is at. So we can determine whether or not a colon exists there, or we used spaces, or we didn't indent properly. So that's what an indentation error is trying to point us to. Some sort of statement, clause that usually expects some sort of indented code underneath it isn't properly receiving that code. The next error that we might come across is a syntax error. Syntax errors are kind of if you want to print a string and you have different quotation types, like a double quote and it ends off with a single quote, so the way that you wrote that line of code is really confusing to Python. It's missing something. It doesn't the way that you're following the rules of Python aren't being established and maintained, and that's what it's trying to say with a syntax error. A type error is when a function usually is involved in it, and when you pass a function some sort of data type that it either doesn't expect or can't do something with. So you have a function, it's going to do some sort of string processing or parsing, and you pass in an integer. Can't run split or rstrip on an integer, can you? So What a type error is doing is it's basically saying, okay, well, you passed in some information on this line, and that information isn't in a specified type that I can do anything with. So a good hint in that case is, okay, well, are the objects that I'm looking at the objects that I expect them to be? Maybe I should do some forced typing, like, change this thing from an integer into a string, for instance. Maybe it'll start to run that code. So a type error is really telling you, okay, you don't know what your objects are. You should understand objects a little better and what's going on in your code at the moment. The next type of error that I'm showing you is a value error. So let's say you have a function and you pass in a parameter like, okay, well, I want the opacity of this colored dot to be, 80%. But let's say you put in like 120%. 120. Well, you can't have 120% opacity. You can't have that kind of contrast. So you've passed in the right type, but the value that you've given is not something that the function can do anything with, either because it's like impossible or you didn't put in a proper value type that it was expecting. And I/O errors may be something that you guys have encountered in your problem sections. Basically, this is one that's like, okay, you're using the input function and that input-output operation fails. Usually this happens with like the open function, essentially saying that like you're trying to open something and it couldn't find that file to open. So there was an output error as opposed to an input error in that case. The next thing we are looking at here is a zero division error. This should be fairly familiar to you. You can't divide something by 0, so this error will get thrown if your math is weird with your zeros. Last thing you might have seen from our classes, guys, is this EOF error, and this occurs with our input function specifically. This isn't one that I see a lot in my everyday life, but this is definitely one that you have seen or will see in your experience in this class. And what EOF error is saying is like, basically when you use that input function that didn't input anything. So it's important to know what each of these errors mean. Please do go on Google Python exception types and see all the different errors that currently exist. Next, guys, we're going to move into some code, and I'm going to just kind of like workshop through how we deal with errors and what kind of errors to expect if we do like a couple of manipulations to our syntax in a way that messes everything up, and how to handle that kind of issue. All right, everyone, here we are in our coding section. I'm just going to run that here. I'm going to show you a handful of errors to show you how I would first interpret the error log and then how I would go about figuring it out. This might actually be a good challenge for you to see if you can figure out what is going to error before I run it. So let's look at this first line here. We have print hello world. You'll notice some discoloration already. So like a lot of times our linters and our user interfaces are trying to help us reduce the amount of errors that we get in our code. So we can already kind of visually see that there should be an error that's passed through here. So we got a syntax error. This said that, okay, well, there's an issue with our code. The first thing you'll notice here in our debugging is that it says, okay, there was an error, and it was with this file. This is kind of like nonsense for us at the moment because we're in a Jupyter notebook, but if you're running this like from Bash or something, it'll give you the file name of the script that you tried to run. It points to where it failed in our run, line 3, and then it shows the line that it failed on. And sometimes it even tries to point an error on like where it specifically did fail. It's not always accurate, so you should never rely on this arrow. However, sometimes it does give you hints as to what went wrong. In this case, it actually did give us the proper hint, but you shouldn't listen to this very often. It also tells us what the error specifically was, which was a syntax error. So we go, oh, syntax error. There should be a syntax error somewhere around here. We see that there's no quotation. Let's see how this runs now. Hello world. Okay, it did in fact run, so we just debugged that error code. Very cool. The next thing I want to do is run this one here, and let's see where our error would be. What kind of error do you think we would get from this first? I mean, you probably could guess that maybe we're going to get an indentation error, but is that the first thing that's thrown? No. Okay, we have invalid syntax. Okay, what's our syntax error? So, okay, first off, it's saying it's on line 5. This is indeed line 5, and it's pointing to here. So in this case, it's actually right again. We have a syntax error, and the syntax error is here. We didn't add our colon. What happens when we get now? we have another error, except now we have that indentation error that we expected. So it says, okay, it expected an indented block for this for loop, but it's not there. We could do something like this, pass, where the for loop doesn't do anything, and it'll still print the last variable of x. But what we really wanted to do was print this iteratively from 0 to 10. What this line is saying is we created a range object which has numbers between 0 and 9, and then we want to iterate through them and print each number once. So let's see what happens when we run this now. Do we get the error? We don't. So our indentation error has now been debugged. Awesome job. Okay, the next thing I want to show you is an error of this sort. What kind of error do we expect to happen from this? We got a type error. So what this is telling us, remember what a type error says. It says that we didn't give it the type that this function needed in order to do its job. Turns out the .join function requires that you pass in a list in order for, so let's see what happens. 2, 4, 5. We also got another type error. So it said, okay, so yeah, we got a type error before, but the problem is, like, it's not only the type of the object itself, but it's the types within it. So it says it expected a string, but it found integers. So what this means is that, okay, not only did it need a list, but it wants a list of strings. What this function does is it takes a list and it converts it into a string separated by whatever you put in between these quotations. So I'm like comma separating this at the moment. Now that these are all strings, this should work. And there we go. Okay, so we have 2, 4, 5 as a string, all separated by commas, which didn't exist there before. Let's add like a semicolon space, and you can see it even more dramatically. There we go. So we had 2 type errors in this function because not only do we have a type error in that we didn't pass in a list, but I had another type error because we didn't pass in a list that was only composed of strings. Last type of error I want to show you is this one here. What kind of error did we get? We didn't get an input-output error, we got a file not found error. So this is not one that I showed you in the list, but it is one that exists, and I wanted to just kind of like throw you off a bit, or like show you something that maybe you didn't expect from that list that you saw. So what will we Intuit expect this error to mean, given that we were just trying to open a text file? Sometimes you don't have to know what the exception is exactly saying in order to understand what they're trying to tell you. In this case, it's like, okay, this file doesn't exist. We couldn't open and read this file because it's not in our directory. And that's what that error means, okay? Okay, guys, so with that, let's finish off for this class and do a recap. All right, what did we learn today, guys? We learned about some common exception types and what they mean, how to define them, how to interpret them. We also looked at, like, okay, once we get an error, how do we look at that error? What is all the stuff that's being thrown at us trying to tell us? And then how to interpret that error to debug and get our code working just fine. So thank you very much, guys, and I'll see you next class.